Hello students and welcome to today's lesson, A Visit of Charity by Eudora Welty. This is part 3 of the story. The lesson is being presented by Dr. P.V. Geeta Lakshmi Patnaik, Associate Professor of English, BCR Government Degree College, Narayanguda, Hyderabad. So students, if you remember, we have already had two parts of this story. We have discussed the first part in which we have looked at the brief biography of Eudora Welty, and we have also looked at the first part of the story. In the second part, we have discussed the rest of the story, and we are now coming to the end of the short story, A Visit of Charity by Eudora Welty. So this is Eudora Welty, students. She was born in 1909 and she died in 2001. So she has a distinguished literary career, and this particular story is one of the best known short stories ever written by her. So here is a brief recap of the previous lesson, students. Eudora Welty was an American short story writer. A prolific writer, she wrote numerous short stories or numerous stories in multiple genres. Stories often portray relationships between individuals and their communities. So this story, A Visit of Charity, is one of her most important short stories, and it was first published in a small literary journal in 1941. What is this story about? I hope you remember, students. It is the story of 14-year-old Marianne and her visit to an old lady's home. So what is the speciality of this young girl, Marianne, and why is she visiting this old lady's home? Because it's not a usual thing. It's not done usually by 14-year-old girls. They generally would like to probably visit their relatives or maybe visit their friends, and definitely not an old lady's home. So why is this young girl, this 14-year-old Marianne, here on a visit to an old lady's home? This is the question that one would obviously ask. Marianne, as we have already seen, is a campfire girl. This means that she belonged to an organization, a youth organization, which specialized in training young girls and boys on how to live in nature, in collaboration with nature, and how to also live in a community, in a human community. So these young people are actually taught to be selfless, altruistic, and also have a caring and helping nature. So this young girl, Marianne, is a campfire girl, and she has arrived at the home to visit any old woman, and to present her with a potted plant. But then her motive is not altruistic or selfless, because she's actually doing this to win a few points as a campfire volunteer. So as we have seen in the previous lessons, in the previous classes, Marianne enters the home, and she approaches the nurse at the reception and introduces herself. And then she tells her the reason why she has come there. Then the nurse, though not exactly happy at this intrusion, somehow gets up, and then she takes her down the corridor, and she stops in front of a particular room and then knocks on it. The door is opened by an old woman, and Marianne sees that there is another woman lying on the bed. So Marianne enters the room, and it's interesting to see that she finds that it is damp, cold, and very uncomfortable. She begins to feel very uneasy and frightened. This is a situation that she has never faced before, students, and though she's not exactly happy in being trapped, she feels actually very trapped in that room. So she's not happy with that experience of being trapped in a room with two old women. There's another thing that is happening below the surface, and that is that there is a friction between the two old women, and they seem to disagree over everything. So this is where we stopped in the previous class, students. So let us quickly take a look at these pictures just to take you through the story. This is a picture which is very similar to the old age home, because it's whitewashed and it's during winter. So the whitewashed walls of the building are actually reflecting the cold ice, according to what the author has stated in the story. So the young girl, Marianne, 14-year-old Marianne, arrives at this place, and she meets a nurse who's dressed all in white and who seems very cold, and she introduces herself, and then the nurse takes her down the corridor. And it's interesting to note that the linoleum on the corridor is actually not exactly in a good condition. So it shows the neglect of this place. And Marianne goes to this room where she finds two old women. One old woman opens the door, and the other old woman is actually lying on the bed, and she doesn't even bother to turn around. The room is all crowded with furniture, and the floor is damp because there is a kind of a moisture, a dampness in the air, and it's very cold outside and very damp inside. So this is, a sign that this old lady's home is not being maintained properly. Nobody is actually having the interest to improve the conditions in which these old women are living. So, and then the two old women, the one woman sits on the rocker, and she and the other old woman on the bed keep arguing over many things. So this is where we stopped, as I just mentioned earlier, students. Now let us see what happens next. The old lady, the old woman who opened the door, she touches a cameo pin on her chest. So this is a cameo pin, students. It's a kind of a brooch which women wear on their shoulder or on the chest. And this is a pin behind it. And generally it has a picture or a painting on it. So let us see what happens next in the story. With the fingers of one hand, she touched a very dirty cameo pen on her chest. What do you do at school? She asked. I don't know, said Marianne. She tried to think, but she could not. Oh, but the flowers are beautiful, the old woman whispered. She seemed to rock faster and faster. Marianne did not see how anyone could rock so fast. Ugly, said the woman in bed. If we bring flowers, Marianne began, and then fell silent. She had almost said that if Campfire Girls brought flowers to the old lady's home, the visit would count one extra point, and if they took a Bible with them on the bus and read it to the old ladies, it counted double. But the old woman had not listened anyway. She was rocking and watching the other one, who watched back from the bed. So there is, like I mentioned earlier, a very palpable, or a very a kind of friction which is obvious to this girl too. So the friction is between the two old women. So the first old woman, who is sitting on the rocking chair, touches a very dirty cameo pin on her chest. The cameo pin is kind of a sign that this old woman was probably from a good family earlier, but now she is being neglected and nobody is there to take care of her, and that is why she is actually having to stay in this old lady's home. The sign that she's wearing it shows, the fact that she's wearing it shows that she's probably from a good family. But the fact that she's here in old lady's home is actually a sign of the neglect that she faces from probably her family members. And when the old woman asks Marianne what she does at school, Marianne is not able to answer because she's not able to remember. She's not able to think at all. She is in a very strange kind of a state where she is not aware of what is going on around her, and she doesn't know what to say. She's almost tongue-tied. So the first old woman says, "But the flowers are beautiful," and she whispers it. She tries to probably she's not used to people coming and visiting her, and so she's so happy that at last somebody has come to see her. And she seems to be overwhelmed, and she seemed to rock faster and faster, says the writer. This is from the perspective of the young girl, of Marianne, and Marianne does not understand how anybody could rock so fast. In fact, she finds it very strange. While the first woman says that the flowers are beautiful, the woman in the bed says ugly. And somehow Marianne feels like she has to justify it, and she's about to say something. She begins, "If we bring flowers," and then she falls silent. The reason is that she had almost been about to say that if Campfire Girls brought flowers to the old lady's home, then she would get one extra point. If you remember, students, she had thought about this earlier. So in a way that the readers also get to know it, that if a Campfire Girl visits an old lady's home, she would get 3 points. But if she brings flowers, then she gets one extra point. So that means she gets 4 points. And if a Campfire Girl brings a Bible with them and reads it to the old ladies, it counts double. So she was about to say this, but then she stops because she notices that the old woman is not actually listening to her. And the old woman is rocking and watching the other old woman on the bed, and the woman on the bed is actually watching back. So this is a very strange situation, and Marianne, who's already feeling very uneasy and uncomfortable, finds that her uneasiness and her discomfort is actually increasing. Poor Addie is ailing. She has to take medicine, see? She said, pointing a horny finger at a row of bottles on the table and rocking so high that her black comfort shoes lifted off the floor like a little child's. I'm no sick than you are, no more sick than you are, said the woman in bed. Oh, yes, you are, said this other woman. I just got more sense than you have, that's all, said the other old woman, nodding her head. That's only the contrary way she talks when you all come, said the first old lady with sudden intimacy. She stopped the rocker with a neat pat of her feet and leaned towards Marianne. Her hand reached over. It felt like a petunia leaf, clinging and just a little sticky. The woman in the bed is Addie, and the other old woman's name is not mentioned at all throughout the story. So the old woman who is sitting in the rocking chair says, "Poor Addie is ailing. She has to take medicine, see?" So the kind of pity that she demonstrates is actually not real pity. In a way, she is trying to tell Marianne that she is not sick, but the other woman, that is Addie, is sick. So she takes a kind of a pleasure in pointing out again and again that Addie is not well. And Addie is equally insistent that she is not sick at all. In fact, she keeps saying that she's quite well. And so this time around, the old woman points at the medicines and she says she has to take medicine, see? And she points to the medicines because she wants this young girl, she wants Marianne to know that the other woman is not well. And she keeps rocking so high, says the author, that her black comfort shoes lifted off the floor like a little child's. And why is she doing that? The fact that she is rocking and rocking also shows that she is not comfortable. The old woman in bed is not comfortable at all. Marianne is not comfortable, and this other old woman who is in the rocking chair is also not comfortable because the rocking motion is showing us or telling us that this woman is also not feeling at ease. So the woman in the bed contradicts her immediately because she says, "I'm no more sick than you are." But then the woman in the rocking chair says, "Oh, yes, you are." While Addie says, "I just got more sense than you have, that's all." So this is the way they keep talking to each other. They keep arguing and they keep throwing back things at each other. And the first old woman says, "That's only the contrary way she talks when you all come." It's as though she is trying to show that she's a friend, that Marianne and this old woman are friends. And she's trying to exclude Addie, the woman in the bed. And suddenly she stops her rocker and she leans towards Marianne. She touches with her hand, she touches Marianne's hand, and it feels like a petunia leaf, says the author. And this is from, like I mentioned earlier, students, from Marianne's perspective. And so Marianne can feel her touch like a petunia leaf. It was clinging and just a little sticky, she says. So even this feeling is so disgusting to the young girl that she definitely does not want to stay there any longer. "Will you hush? Will you hush?" cried the other one. Marianne leaned back rigidly in her chair. "When I was a little girl like you, I went to school and all," said the old woman in the same intimate, menacing voice. "Not here, another town." "Hush," said the sick woman. "You never went to school, you never came, and you never went. You never were anything, only here. You never were born, you don't know anything, your head is empty, your heart and hands and your old black purse are all empty. You showed it to me, and yet you talk, 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 talk all the time until I think I'm losing my mind. Who are you? You're a stranger, a perfect stranger. Don't you know you're a stranger? Is it possible that they have actually done a thing like this to anyone? Sent them in a stranger to talk and rock and tell away her whole long rigmarole? Do they seriously suppose that I'll be able to keep it up day in, day out, night in, night out, living in the same room with a terrible old woman forever?" So this is a very long paragraph, students. So if you see, the old women are sparring like their opponents in a ring where they are actually fighting with each other. So as the first old woman says that whenever other girls, maybe probably other campfire girls come, this old woman keeps saying that she's not well, she falls sick. And the woman in the bed says, will you hush, will you hush? Addie, that's the woman in the bed, she says, will you keep quiet? But this old woman doesn't care. Marianne is very, very uncomfortable, and so she leans back rigidly in her chair. She's not at all comfortable. And the first old woman says, when I was a little girl like you, I went to school and all. Not here, another town, she says. But the woman in the bed is quick to contradict her and she says, hush, you never went to school, she says. You never came, you never went. And she tries to say that all this is a sham. Why do you even talk? She says. You keep talking. Your head is empty, your heart and hands and your old black purse are all empty, she says. Why? And she's so frustrated, students, that the frustration comes out in a flow of words. The words are unstoppable. She keeps talking and talking, and she's so fed up with being stuck in this room with the other woman. It is so sad, students, because these women cannot escape each other. They are stuck with each other, probably for years and years. They don't have the means, or it's not possible for them to leave this old lady's home. So they are stuck here. They have to see each other's face every day. If you imagine, students, it must be very, very difficult to be cooped up in a room with a person whom you don't like at all, and you have to keep listening to them talk the whole day. So the woman in the bed is very, very frustrated, and she vents her frustration in front of the young girl, Marianne. Marianne saw the old woman's eyes grow bright and turn towards her. This old woman was looking at her with despair and calculation in her face. Her small lips suddenly dropped apart and exposed a half circle of false teeth with tan gums. Come here, I want to tell you something, she whispered. Come here. Marianne was trembling, and her heart nearly stopped beating altogether for a moment. Now, Addie, said the first old woman, that's not polite. Do you know what's really the matter with old Addie today? She too looked at Marianne. One of her eyelids dropped low. The matter? The child repeated stupidly. What's the matter with her? Why? She's mad because it's her birthday, said the first old woman, beginning to rock again and giving a little crow as though she had answered her own riddle. Even this slide, students, this part of the story is very important because it brings to the fore, it brings to the open the kind of the relationship that these two women have. This is a very difficult relationship because, like I mentioned earlier, these two women are cooped up in a single room, and they have to see each other day in and day out, night in and night out, and they have to bear each other's idiosyncrasies, their behavior, their way of speaking, their mannerisms, and it is so frustrating. And so Marianne sees the old woman in the bed. Addie's eyes grow bright and turn towards her. Until now, the woman was very listless, but now she has become desperate. You can see the despair and calculation in her eyes, in her face, she says. So her lips opened, and Marianne could see teeth and the false teeth and the gums and all that. And it is really a very disturbing sight. And the woman calls the young girl, she calls Marianne to come close to her. And she says, come here, I want to tell you something. So Marianne was trembling. Her heart nearly stopped beating. And then the other old woman says, now, Addie, that's not polite. Don't call her like that towards you. That's what she's saying. And then she tells Marianne, she asks her, do you really know what's the matter with old Addie today? And she winks at her. And the young girl doesn't understand what's wrong, and she says, the matter? What's the matter with her? And the first old woman says, she's mad because it's her birthday. And she gives a little crow. She begins to rock again. So the first old woman is actually trying to irritate the other woman. Probably it is a birthday. Most probably it's not. We don't know that. But then the first old woman is actually trying to irritate the other old woman. And what happens next? It is not, screamed the old woman in bed. It is not my birthday. No one knows when that is but myself. And will you please be quiet and say nothing more, or I'll go straight out of my mind. She turned her eyes toward Marianne again, and presently she said in the soft, foggy voice, when the worst comes to the worst, I ring this bell and the nurse comes. One of her hands was drawn out from under the patched counterpane, a thin little hand with enormous black freckles. With a finger which would not hold still, she pointed to a little bell on the table among the bottles. How old are you? Marianne breathed. Now she could see the old woman in bed very closely and plainly and very abruptly from all sides as in dreams. She wondered about her. She wondered for a moment as though there was nothing else in the world to wonder about. It was the first time such a thing had happened to Marianne. I won't tell. So, in the previous part of the story, we have seen how the first old woman takes a kind of a malicious, a very cruel kind of pleasure in telling Marianne that the other old woman, that is Addie, is in this strange mood or she's irritable because it's a birthday and nobody is there to celebrate it. But Addie is equally insistent that it is not her birthday. In fact, she screams and she says, it is not my birthday. Nobody knows except myself, she says. And don't say anything more or I'll go mad, she says. And then she turns her eyes towards Marianne and tells her that when the worst comes to the worst, I ring this bell and the nurse comes. These few words convey the total frustration and agony that this old woman is undergoing. And probably this is a scene that is played over and over again. And so she's so frustrated, she cannot move out of the bed, she cannot escape from the other woman, and the other woman is insisting in irritating her again and again. So one of her hands is out of the counterpane or the bed sheet, and Marian notices that her hand is very thin and it has enormous black freckles or black marks, which usually, appear on the limbs of old people. So with a finger, which is actually shaking and shivering, she points to a bell which is there on the table. And she's trying to imply that when things get unbearable with the other woman in the room, then she rings the bell and asks for help. And the nurse comes and probably maybe gives her some kind of comfort or maybe some relief from the other woman. And suddenly Marian asks, how old are you? Probably she wants to find out if this other woman is really very old. It's not an important question, but then it's not that necessary. But somehow, to Marianne at that particular moment, this question is the most important thing. And so she asks her, how old are you? But the other woman, the old woman in the bed, Addie, says, I won't tell. I won't tell. The old face on the pillow, where Marianne was bending over it, slowly gathered and collapsed. Soft whimpers came out of the small open mouth. It was a sheep that she sounded like, a little lamb. Marianne's face drew very close. The yellow hair hung forward. She's crying. She turned a bright burning face up to the first old woman. That's Addie for you, the old woman said spitefully. Marianne jumped up and moved toward the door. For the second time, the claw almost touched her hair, but it was not quick enough. The little girl put her cap on. Well, it was a real visit, said the old woman, following Marianne through the doorway and all the way out into the hall. Then from behind, she suddenly clutched the child with her sharp little fingers. Oh, little girl, have you a penny to spare for an old woman that's not got anything of her own? We don't have a thing in the world, not a penny for candy, not a thing. Little girl, just a nickel, a penny, she says. Marianne is already very scared and very uncomfortable and very nervous, and the incident that happens now makes her even more frightened. The old woman in the bed says that she will not tell her age, she will not reveal her age, and as Marianne notices, as she keeps looking at her, the old woman in the bed begins to cry, and the sound is like the sound of a sheep, like a little lamb, says the author. Marianne's face drew very close, and she looks at the old woman in the bed, and she realizes that Addie is crying. So she turns her face towards the first old woman, and she says she's crying. But look at the way the old woman reacts. She says, "That's Addie for you," and it's said very spitefully. So she is not at all sympathetic towards the woman in the bed, and it's suddenly totally unbearable for Marianne, and she jumps up and moves towards the door. For the second time, says the author, the claw almost touched her, and this claw refers to the old woman's hand, which is almost like a claw. It's thin, It's, bony and it looks like a claw. But then it almost touched her head, but Marianne escapes because she puts a cap on her head and she begins to move out. And the first old woman follows her through the doorway and into the hall, and she says, "Well, it was a real visit." And she clutches the child's hand with the sharp fingers and she says, "Oh, little girl, have you a penny to spare?" She's literally begging Marianne for some money. And this is totally an experience that Marianne does not want. Marianne pulled violently against the old hands for a moment before she was free. Then she ran down the hall without looking behind her and without looking at the nurse who was reading Field and Stream at her desk. The nurse, after another triple motion to consult her wristwatch, asked automatically the question put to visitors in all institutions: "Won't you stay and have dinner with us?" Marianne never replied. She pushed the heavy door open into the cold air and ran down the steps. Under the prickly shrub, she stooped and quickly, without being seen, retrieved a red apple she had hidden there. Her yellow hair hung under the white, her yellow hair under the white cap, her scarlet coat, her bare knees flashing in the sunlight as she ran to meet the big bus rocketing through the street. "Wait for me," she shouted. As though at an imperial command, the bus ground to a halt. She jumped on and took a big bite out of the apple. So, Marianne has this experience where the first old woman clutches her hand and she tries to pull her back and she tries to beg some money from her. But somehow Marianne escapes. She pulls violently against the old hands and then she becomes free. And she ran down the hall, says the author. She runs down the hall and she doesn't wait. She doesn't try to talk to the nurse who actually calls after her and who says that, "Why don't you have dinner with us?" But then Marianne doesn't reply and she leaves the place. And she comes out into the cold air. And if you remember, at the beginning of the story, we have seen how she stops at a prickly bush, at a prickly shrub. And this time also she stops there and she stoops quickly and retrieves a red apple she had hidden there. At the beginning of the story, students, if you remember, the author doesn't tell us what she does at the shrubs. We only know that she stops for a moment. But now we see that she had actually hidden a red apple and now she retrieves it and runs down the pathway. And her yellow hair under the white cap, her scarlet coat, her bare knees flashing in the sunlight as she ran to meet the big bus rocketing through the street. So she's lucky that the bus is actually there and she runs to the bus and she says, "Wait for me." And as though a queen or a princess has commanded it, the bus stops. The little girl, Marianne, jumps on, and the first thing she does is she takes a big bite out of the apple. So with this, the story comes to an end, students. So the last part of the story tells us many things. So as we have seen at the beginning, Marianne has come very reluctantly to this place and she has come here only because she needs to make some points as a campfire girl. So as the author tells us, she gets 3 points if she visits the old lady's home and 1 point extra if she takes a plant and gives it to them. So Marianne gets her 4 points, of course, and but then the experience is so difficult, so strange that she runs out of the room. As you remember, both the old women keep quarreling constantly, and the atmosphere of in the room is so stifling and so crowded that it almost makes her feel claustrophobic. And she rushes out of the her room and then out of the old lady's home and comes out into the bright cold air. And she retrieves her apple and then she boards the bus. But then, why does she leave the apple there in the first place? And why does she retrieve it? And why does she eat it the first thing as soon as she jumps onto the bus? These are questions that you have to think about, students. So maybe the little girl doesn't want to share her apple with the persons that she has come to visit. Maybe that's the reason she has hidden it in the shrub, because if she takes it inside, then she would have to share it with them. Maybe this is what is true in the story. So the moment she comes out, she remembers that she has hidden the apple there, retrieves it, and then as soon as she climbs onto the bus, she eats it as though she's glad that she has She doesn't need to share it with anybody. Maybe she's so hungry, maybe she's so upset that she'll, gain some kind of comfort from the apple. We don't know. We can only interpret or we can only guess, students. So, this is the story, A Visit of Charity. Now, let us move on to the analysis of this short story, A Visit of Charity by Eudora Welty. The first thing that we look at when we analyze a short story, students, is the story, the characters. So let us see who the important characters are. As we have seen, Marianne is the protagonist of the story. She is the main character. And we see that Marianne is a 14-year-old girl who has straight yellow hair covered in a white pointed cap, and she wears a red coat. She is very reluctantly attending a nursing home or an old lady's home as part of a Campfire Girl duties, which is to pay a visit to some old lady. So it's not as though it's a specific old lady, it could be any old lady. The motives for a visit are not that of compassion for others. We have discussed this before too, but rather for the selfishness for her own selfishness, in the hope that she would gain more points for her Campfire Girl status. So this is Marianne, students. Now let us go to the other two characters, the old woman and the aide, and Addie, sorry. When Marianne enters the room, she is greeted by the old woman who has a square smile, a bony face, and a cough like a sheep's bleating. So these are the important points that you need to remember, which describe the old woman, the first old woman. The fact that she has a square smile, a bony face, and a cough which is like a sheep's bleating. Then Marianne notices Addie, who is lying flat in her bed with a cap on. So this old woman has a bunchy white face and red eyes, and she seems to be the older of the two. Okay, right. The personalities of the two are very different, students, and this is because the old woman is very polite and talkative, while Addie speaks very less. But when she does speak, she speaks with a distaste for everything. Right. And the two seem to have lived together for a long time as they know much about each other. Addie seems to be sick on the day that Marianne visits. The old woman states, of course, that it is Addie's birthday, but we don't really know. Is Addie always sick? Is it really her birthday? Marianne doesn't know that, and the readers also don't know. So it could be just that day, or it could be something which is happening every day in their lives. Okay, right. Now let us take a quick look at the themes and the conflicts in the story. The first theme, of course, is selfishness. The basic theme of the story is suggested by the obvious irony of the title, for Marianne's visit is not one of true charity, but rather a formal, institutionalized gesture. She's only doing it because, she is a Campfire Girl. From the beginning of the story, Marianne does not think of the two old women as people like herself. She is not only aware of the strangeness of the old ladies, but she's also become a stranger to herself. She's actually thrown out of a familiar world. She doesn't belong here. It's as though she is in a grotesque dream world, a very strange, a very disturbing dream world. And she feels her difference from the old ladies. She intensely feels it. And so she feels her own separation and isolation. She doesn't belong here at all, students. This is not her world. She is thrust into a world which is very strange and alien to her. And so that is the reason she feels as though she's in a dreamlike state. So this symbolic sense of alienation explains the strange dreamlike effect of the nursing home on Marianne. This is an important point, students. You have to remember this. That's the reason throughout the story, we see how once she enters the old woman's room, the room of the old women, her she begins to behave strangely. She doesn't really listen. She doesn't. Is not able to hear properly. She's not able to speak. She is tongue-tied. It's as though she's disoriented. So this is the sense of alienation, the sense of not belonging in the world of the old women. So she hides the apple before entering the old home. So this implies that she did not want to share her apple with anyone. And as though she was afraid that if she brings it in, then she cannot bring it out. She has to share it with the other people. So overall, when you look at this story, Marianne seems like a very selfish person because all her motives are based on what she gains from the experience, rather than on the fact that she really wants to help them or probably be of use to them, to the old women. Marian can be seen as a representation of people in the society around us, students. It's not as though she is just a person in her own sense. She is actually a representation of people in the society around us. So she stands for the selfishness and lack of concern towards others that is present in all of us. So this is a very important theme. The other theme is the treatment of the elderly. Not only does this story speak of selfishness, which blinds society to the needs of others, but it specifically focuses on that selfishness, which is associated with the treatment of the elderly in nursing homes. So Marian describes the room in which the two old ladies are staying, and this room is compared to a jail because it is small, wet, dark, and it has a closed door. The old women are not free to come out. The nurse who leads Marianne to the old lady's room, acts as if she's a prison guard rather than a nurse. She is not kind or compassionate, and she doesn't show any kind of concern for the old women. So Marianne is not meant to represent one person. She represents the whole society that has become insensitive to the needs of the elderly. So it's not just Marianne who represents the society. The nurse also represents society. And the final theme is interpersonal conflict. So there is a conflict throughout the story, right? And especially the conflict between the old women. So within the story, Addie and the old woman argue about a variety of different topics, such as whether it is Addie's birthday or not, and whether a campfire girl came to visit them or not before Marianne did. So these are many issues which, very silly issues over which these two women keep fighting. But then these issues are not important. What is more important is the frustration, the whole torture that these women have to undergo because they are trapped in this room with each other for years and years together. So that is something that the story talks about. Now let us take a look at the setting. A visit of charity takes place at an elderly home on the outskirts of town. The outside of the home had been decorated by the city with prickly dark shrubs, and this is meant to beautify the place. And the exterior of the building is made up of whitewashed brick, and it reflects the sunlight like a block of ice. So the outside of the building, almost like the inside, suggests a coldness and neglect, which is again tied to the main theme of neglect of the elderly. So the room in which the two women are staying is also dark and cluttered and wet. And as we have seen earlier, Marianne compares it to a prison. So the setting in the short story is very essential, students, in the portrayal of the theme because it is mentioned as a dark and cold setting, the neglect of the elderly becomes more prominent throughout the story. So the setting plays a very, very important role. Now let us take a look at the symbolism. Eudora Welty employs symbolism to convey her feelings towards human nature through the use of vivid imagery, diction, and significant details. And the first symbol is the use of the white color. So this white color symbolizes many things, students. So when Marianne first approaches the nursing home, it is described as a very cold place, right? It is described as being whitewashed brick, and how it reflects the white sunlight, like a winter sunlight, like a block of ice. So the color white and the ice imply the coldness of the home. Also, if you see, the nurse wears a white uniform and she looks cold. So this is accompanied, with the overall cold and bitter attitude. So she has a very strange attitude, which is very cold, and the whole building is cold. And throughout the story, the author is actually showing that the nursing home is not only physically cold, it's also mentally and emotionally cold. So this provides the overall impression of the home as being unwelcoming, dead, and unloving. It is not warm, it is not friendly, it is not loving. So the home, the old lady's home, is actually unwelcome. I mean, it's unwelcoming, dead, and unloving. This is very important, students. Then we see that there are numerous references to clock or time. This is because the nursing home is described as a clock working on time. It is like as though it is being described as a place which is always on schedule but always slow moving. So Welty describes the home as even smelling like a clock, if you remember. That's the scene where the nurse and Marianne walk down the corridor. There is a description about the strange, unusual smell which is there in the corridor, in the hall, and it seems like the interior of a clock, she says. Not only is the house a working clock, but also The nurse is described as moving mechanically and checking her wristwatch. She keeps there's a triple motion that the writer talks about, and where she stops in her tracks, extends her arm, bends her elbow, and leans forward from the hips, only to look at the watch which is strapped to her wrist. So the description of this nurse also, uh, you know, emphasizes the description of the overall nursing home, and the clockwork, or the comparison to a clock is reinforced by describing the nurse's actions. Then there is a reference to animals. Many significant details express that the nursing home is much like a zoo, filled with animals all trapped inside their cages wanting to get out. As Marianne walked down the hall, all the doors were closed. When she entered the room smelled wet, showing that the room was ignored or neglected and unsanitary. It was also small and tight, with too much furniture, and there's no place to actually move in the room. The elders in the room, the old women, seemed wild. They had pet like mouths and red eyes like sheep. One was even compared to talking like a lamb. So these are all descriptions that we see, students, where the writer uses symbols to say something deeper and more significant than the actual words, right? As a final word, we have come to the end of the lesson, students. A Visit of Charity by Eudora Welty conveys the theme that life is too short, and if we have to make it more meaningful, we should really make an effort to reach out to those who are in need of care and concern. Charity is a virtue that has to be cultivated by one and all if the world is to be made a better place. So the author uses a tight metaphoric structure and a sharp focus to convey this message. So this brings us to the end of the lesson, students. I hope you enjoyed it. So read the story once again and try to actually experience the feelings and the various thoughts and ideas that run through Marianne's mind, and try to understand what is it exactly that Eudora Welty is trying to tell us. So that's all for today, students. Have a good day and bye. Thank you.